I've been a hospice nurse for years, and if there's one truth I've learned, it's this. Death has a rhythm. You start to notice it after a while, the shallow breaths, the mottling on the skin, the sudden quiet in a room that used to be filled with labored gasps. But there are some signs, some warnings, that no medical textbook ever prepared me for. And for me, nothing was stranger or more unsettling than the black cat. The first time it happened, I was on the night shift at our inpatient hospice unit. The halls were dim, the kind of quiet you only hear when half the building is asleep and the other half is waiting to pass on. I was doing my rounds when I noticed movement near room 12. At first, I thought one of the family members had left the door cracked and a visitor's pet slipped inside. But when I looked closer, I froze. There, curled neatly on the floor outside the door, was a sleek black cat. Its fur was glossy, its body still. It wasn't restless or curious like cats usually are. It was just waiting. I frowned, looked around, and whispered, "How on earth did you get in here?" No pets were allowed in the building unless approved. I bent down to coax it away, but when I reached out, the cat didn't move. It just lifted its head, blinked slowly, and went right back to staring at the crack under the door. I'll never forget the feeling in my chest, like my heart skipped a beat. Inside that room was a man named Mr. Lawson. He was in his final days, lungs riddled with cancer. And before my shift was over, just a few hours later, he was gone. When I stepped back into the hall, the cat was gone too. No sound, no trace, just empty tiles. At first, I chalked it up to coincidence. Maybe the cat belonged to someone in the neighborhood. Maybe it slipped in through the courtyard doors. But then it happened again and again. Every time that black cat appeared outside a patient's door, someone inside would die before my shift ended. Sometimes within hours, sometimes minutes. Always the same curled up, waiting. I started asking around. "Have you guys seen a black cat wandering the halls?" Some nurses looked at me strangely. Others just nodded, quietly, almost like they didn't want to talk about it. One older nurse finally said, "Yeah, I've seen it. Been here 20 years, and it's been around as long as I can remember. Shows up when someone's about to go. Like it knows." She shrugged and walked away, leaving me cold. Because deep down, I knew she was right. It wasn't just the staff. Families noticed too. One night, a woman came out of her mother's room in tears. She pointed at the hallway and asked me, trembling, "Whose cat is that?" I turned, and sure enough, there it was, sitting perfectly still outside the door. Before I could answer, she whispered, "It's waiting for her, isn't it?" I tried to reassure her, tell her it was just a stray, but the words felt hollow even as they left my mouth. Her mother passed before sunrise. The night that haunts me most happened last winter. Room 7. The patient was a man in his early 50s, too young to be there, but cancer doesn't care about age. His wife and daughter were at the bedside, clutching his hands, whispering prayers. When I stepped into the hallway, I stopped dead in my tracks. The cat wasn't lying down this time. It was sitting upright, tail curled neatly around its paws, staring directly at the door. Not the crack beneath it, the actual door. Almost as if it could see through. I don't know how long I stood there, frozen. Eventually, I forced myself to move past, pretending not to notice. But the image burned into my mind. An hour later, his monitor flatlined. When I stepped back into the hall after the pronouncement, the cat was gone. We don't talk about it much, even among ourselves. New staff sometimes mention it in passing, like, "Hey, weird thing, did anyone see a cat?" And the older nurses just say, "You'll get used to it," but you never really get used to it. Some think it's just a stray, a coincidence. Others whisper that it's something more, a messenger, a guide. I don't know. What I do know is this. In all my years, I've never once seen that cat near a patient who survived the night. I don't claim to understand it. I can chart symptoms, predict decline, manage medications, but nothing explains why a sleek black cat appears only when death is near. And maybe that's the point. Maybe there are things we're not meant to explain. But every time I walk those halls and catch a shadow out of the corner of my eye, my stomach knots. Because I know what I might see next. A pair of yellow eyes, steady and patient, waiting outside a door. And if I do, I know what's coming. So, tell me, if you were walking those hospice halls late at night, and you saw that black cat curled outside a patient's room, would you keep walking, or would you stop and stare? Because I've learned one thing: once you see it, you never forget it. I've worked nights in hospice long enough to know the building has its own moods. The halls breathe differently after midnight. Machines sound louder, families whisper softer, and sometimes, if you listen closely, you hear things you can't explain. It was around 3 in the morning when it happened. I was halfway through my rounds, moving slow and quiet so as not to wake anyone. Most of the patients were asleep, sedated, or somewhere between waking and that final crossing. The fluorescent lights above hummed faintly, but the halls themselves were still, too still. And then I heard it. At first, I thought it was one of the radios families sometimes leave playing in the rooms. A voice, soft, warm, drifting out into the corridor. But when I paused, I realized it wasn't tinny or mechanical. It was a woman's voice, clear and alive, carrying an old hymn I recognized from my childhood. It wasn't loud, just a gentle humming, like someone was walking slowly down the hall, keeping herself company with music. It had a strange effect on me, calming and unsettling all at once. The kind of voice that makes you want to close your eyes and drift, but also makes the hairs on your arms rise. I turned the corner, expecting to see one of the aides making rounds. Sometimes they hummed or whispered to themselves when they thought no one was listening. But when I reached the end of the hallway, the sound didn't fade. It grew clearer, closer. The hallway was empty. No staff, no families, no one standing there. Just dim light and closed doors. And yet, the hymn kept going. Every note smooth, mournful, steady, like whoever sang it wasn't running out of breath. I froze, listening. I even whispered, "Hello?" But the humming didn't stop. It just floated past me, as though the singer had slipped by unseen. I swear I felt the air stir, like someone brushing against me as they walked by. Though the hall was bare, I tried to shake it off. Told myself maybe the sound was carrying from another part of the building. Maybe I was tired and imagining things. But when I passed room 9, something in me sank. Inside that room was Mrs. Andrews. She'd been declining for days, her family taking turns at the bedside. Tonight, though, they'd all gone home to rest. I peeked in. She was still, her chest rising and falling faintly, each breath shallow. She wasn't awake. She couldn't have been humming. I stood there for a long time, listening. The hymn faded, soft as a whisper, until it was gone. The silence that followed felt heavier than before, pressing in from the walls. I finished my rounds with a knot in my stomach, but nothing else unusual happened. At dawn, when we gathered for shift change, we got the call from the night nurse in room 9. Mrs. Andrews had passed, peacefully, in her sleep. Later that week, I attended her funeral. Her family asked me to come. Sometimes we get close to them in those last weeks. I sat near the back, hands folded, eyes heavy with exhaustion. The service began. And when the first hymn started, my heart nearly stopped. It was the same song, the exact same hymn I had heard in the hallway that night at 3 in the morning. Every note matched. Every rise and fall of the melody was identical to the one that had floated through the hospice halls, sung by a voice that no one could explain. I felt my chest tighten, My eyes sting. Because I realized then, it hadn't just been a song. It had been a farewell, a summons, a voice no one saw, guiding her out. I've heard many strange things in hospice, but nothing has haunted me quite like that hymn. Sometimes, when I'm on the night shift and the building falls silent, I catch myself listening for it again, wondering if it will return, wondering who it will come for next. And I'll tell you this, if you're ever in a hospice hallway at 3 a.m. and you hear a woman humming an old hymn, don't bother looking for her. You won't find her. Just know that somewhere, behind one of those doors, someone's journey is about to end. So let me ask you, if you heard that hymn, soft and sweet in the dark, would you follow the sound, or would you run the other way? I've worked in hospice long enough to know when the body is shutting down. You learn the signs, labored breaths, mottling on the skin, the slowing of the pulse. But no matter how many patients I've cared for, there are things that happen in those final hours that I'll never be able to explain. There was one man in particular. I'll never forget him. His name was Mr. Riley. He was in his 70s, frail from weeks of decline. But even in his weakest moments, he carried himself with dignity. His family had spent most of the evening by his side, holding his hands, telling stories, whispering things only families share in those last moments. By midnight, they finally left to get a few hours of rest, promising they'd be back by morning. That left me alone with him during the overnight hours. I sat by his bed, monitoring his breathing, adjusting his oxygen, making sure he was comfortable. It was quiet in the building 3 a.m. Quiet when the world feels hollow and even the machines sound distant. The only light came from the dim glow over his bed and the soft pulse of the monitor beside him. I was jotting down vitals when I noticed movement. Out of the corner of my eye, I saw his lips forming words. His eyes, cloudy and half shut for hours, were open wide. He wasn't looking at me, he was staring past me, above me, at something I couldn't see. Then he smiled. It wasn't the weak, tired smile I'd seen earlier when his children held his hand. This was something else. It was radiant, like someone had lifted all the weight from his chest in that single moment. His arms, which had barely had the strength to move for days, suddenly lifted upward. Both arms, reaching out into the air above him, trembling with effort but filled with unmistakable intent. And then, in a voice cracked from illness but certain as a prayer, he whispered, "You came back for me." I froze. I glanced around the room, but we were alone. Just me, him, and the faint hiss of the oxygen. But the way he said it so sure, so relieved it didn't feel like he was talking to nothing. It felt like someone was really there, someone only he could see. His smile never left his face. His arms stayed lifted, trembling slightly, as though he were waiting to be embraced. His breathing quickened for a moment, then slowed. And just like that, he was gone. His arms lowered back onto the sheets as if guided down gently, his chest stilled. The monitor let out that flat, endless tone we all dread. I sat there for a long time, staring at him, shaken in a way I rarely let myself be. I've seen many deaths, some peaceful, some painful, some drawn out, but that felt different. It wasn't just death claiming him, it was reunion. When his family returned later that morning, I told them he had passed quietly in the night. His daughter wiped her eyes and asked, "Did he say anything before he went?" I hesitated, but finally I said, "He smiled, and he reached out, like someone had come for him." She covered her mouth, tears spilling over. Then she whispered, "That's how he used to greet my mother." Every time she walked into the room, he'd open his arms and say, "You came back for me." The room went silent. His children clung to each other, and I felt a heaviness in my chest I couldn't put into words. It was then I realized what he had seen, what had lifted his spirit in those last moments. I can't prove it. I can't chart it on a medical record or explain it to anyone who hasn't stood in that room. But I believe it. I believe she came back for him. And since that night, I look at death differently. Not just as an ending, but as a doorway. A place where love waits, even after years of absence. So I'll ask you, if you were at the bedside, and you saw a dying patient suddenly smile, reach up with both arms, and whisper to someone you couldn't see, would you think it was the fever? Or would you believe, like I do, that the final visitor had come? I worked hospice long enough to know the building itself had rhythms, creaks in the walls, hums in the vents. Even the way light fell differently in the halls at night. You tell yourself it's just old construction, just a place showing its age. But there was one thing we couldn't explain, no matter how many times it happened: the service elevator. It was the oldest elevator in the building, tucked at the far end of the corridor. We rarely used it except for supplies, patient transfers, or when families moved furniture in and out. It had this deep groan when the cables engaged, and a heavy shudder whenever the doors opened. You always knew when it was moving, it wasn't subtle. But on nights when someone was close to passing, that elevator had a way of coming up on its own. I'll never forget the first time I noticed it. It was just after 2 a.m, during a long shift. The unit was quiet. Families were sleeping in recliners or had gone home. The only sounds were the soft beeping of monitors and the occasional shuffle of shoes against the linoleum. I was at the nurse's station when I heard the distant grind of cables. I looked up just in time to see the elevator doors slide open at the end of the hall. No one stepped out. The hallway was empty. The light inside the elevator glowed pale against the dark corridor, waiting. After a few seconds, the doors slid shut again with that low sigh of machinery. I didn't think much of it until later that night, when one of my patients, Mr. Klein, took his final breath. His family had been gathered all day. He slipped away quietly, without struggle. When I looked at the clock, I realized it was the same time the elevator had opened. At first, I told myself it was coincidence. Old machinery malfunctions. Elevators sometimes stop randomly. But it kept happening. There was a week where we lost 3 patients, one after another. And every single time, the service elevator arrived first. The same pattern. The low groan, the slow open of the doors, the glow spilling into an empty hallway, and then silence. By morning, someone was gone. It got to the point where the sound made my stomach turn. Because once you heard that grind in the middle of the night, you knew. You didn't need the vitals, the modeling, the Shane Stokes breathing. You already knew the end was near. The older nurses never looked surprised when it happened. One of them, a woman who'd worked there longer than I'd been alive, leaned over to me once and whispered, "It comes to collect." I laughed nervously, but she didn't smile. She just turned back to her charting like she'd said nothing unusual. One night stands out the most. Room 14. A woman named Esther. She had been fighting for days, her family praying at her bedside, her breaths shallow and ragged but stubborn. We'd all thought she might hold on through the weekend. But just after 3 a.m, I heard the elevator again. The sound carried down the hall, heavy and metallic. I stood, frozen, watching as the doors opened. This time, they stayed open longer than usual. The fluorescent light inside flickered faintly, as if someone were standing there, deciding whether to step out. But the hall was empty. My chest tightened as the seconds stretched. And then, finally, the doors closed with a dull thud. Minutes later, Esther's monitor flatlined. I rushed in with the team, but it was too late. She was gone. Her family held each other, sobbing softly, and I kept glancing at the door, half expecting to hear the elevator again. After that, I stopped telling myself it was a glitch. It wasn't just bad wiring or a faulty sensor. The timing was too exact, too consistent. Some of the aides refused to even walk by the service elevator at night. They'd take the long way around, avoiding that end of the corridor entirely. And truthfully, I didn't blame them. Because by then, I had learned something. When the elevator comes, it doesn't come for us. It comes for them. I can't explain it. I don't try anymore. But I can tell you this. In hospice, you see many things you can't write down in a chart. And every time I hear the old cables groan and see those doors slide open to nothing, I feel the same chill run through me. Because I know that somewhere, behind one of those doors, a patient is about to take their final ride. So, I'll ask you, if you were working that night, and you saw the elevator open to an empty hallway, would you step closer to see if anyone was inside? Or would you turn the other way, knowing it wasn't meant for you? I've worked in hospice long enough to know the nights have their own personality. The days are filled with visitors, laughter mixed with tears, families trying to make peace with the inevitable. But when night falls, the building changes. The laughter quiets. The halls stretch out longer than they seem in daylight. And that's when you hear things you can't explain. One sound in particular still chills me when I think about it. Footsteps. Small ones. It was close to 2 a.m, the hour when exhaustion makes every shadow seem sharper. I was at the nurse's station finishing chart notes when I heard it a patter, quick and light, like bare feet against linoleum. At first, I thought I was imagining it, that maybe it was just the creak of the old vents. But the sound grew clearer, closer. Tiny footsteps running down the hall, stopping, then starting again. I froze. We had no pediatric patients, no children on the floor at all. Hospice is for the end of life, not the beginning. The youngest person I'd ever cared for there was in their 40s. I stood up, craning my neck toward the sound. The hall stretched empty in both directions, lights dimmed, every door closed. Yet the footsteps carried on, racing just out of sight, the way children play tag in long hallways. I tried to brush it off, telling myself maybe it was the night guard making rounds, or maybe another nurse moving quickly. But the sound was too light, too playful. Not the heavy stride of an adult, but the darting steps of a child. The strangest moment came a week later. I was with a patient, an older woman named Helen. She had dementia, and her lucidity came and went like waves, sometimes sharp as glass, sometimes fogged over completely. That night, she was clear. Her breathing was shallow, her time short, but her eyes followed something I couldn't see. She smiled faintly and whispered, "Do you hear them playing too?" My chest tightened. I swallowed hard and asked gently, "Who do you hear, Helen?" Her eyes flicked to the doorway. "The children, running down the hall. They sound so happy." I wanted to comfort her, but the truth was, I'd heard them too. I didn't know what to say. I just smoothed the blanket over her chest and nodded. Hours later, she slipped away in her sleep. After that, I started paying closer attention, and I realized I wasn't the only one. Other aides mentioned it too. They'd hear giggling, the faint squeak of sneakers, or the soft slap of feet racing past their stations. Every time we went to look, the halls were empty. There was one night I'll never forget. I was walking down the west corridor, carrying fresh linens. The hall was dim, shadows pooled in the corners. Halfway down, I heard the footsteps behind me, fast, playful, like a child trying to catch up. My stomach dropped. I turned around quickly, expecting to see, I don't know what, but there was nothing. Just the empty stretch of hallway and the faint hum of the lights. Then came the laugh. Soft, high-pitched, unmistakably a child's giggle. It echoed once and faded. My arms prickled with gooseflesh. The old staff say it's a good sign when you hear them. They believe the children come to guide the dying, to play in the halls and remind them they aren't alone on their way out. Maybe it's comforting if you look at it that way. But for me, it's never felt comforting. It feels like a reminder that this place belongs as much to the dead as it does to the living. Now, whenever I'm on nights, I find myself listening without meaning to. Every creak, every hum, every shuffle of air makes me hold my breath. And sometimes, more often than I'd like, I hear them. The soft patter of tiny feet running past, the playful rhythm of children who were never supposed to be here. And I know, somewhere in the building, someone's time is almost up. So I'll ask you, if you were walking those dim hospice halls after midnight and you heard little footsteps running past you in a place that had never held children, would you chase after the sound? Or would you let them pass and pretend you heard nothing at all? I've worked hospice long enough to know that the building has a memory. It holds every loss, every goodbye, and sometimes you feel it pressing in around you on the night shift. You don't talk about it much, but every nurse and aide who's stayed past midnight knows there are sounds in those halls that don't belong to the living. One of those sounds is the crying nurse. It was my second year working there when I first heard her. It was around 2:30 inches the morning, the time when the floor goes quiet, families sleeping in recliners, patients breathing slow and shallow, the monitors soft and steady. I was walking toward the supply closet to grab linens when I froze. From behind the door, I heard muffled sobbing. It sounded raw, real, the kind of crying you only hear when someone's breaking down, trying hard not to let anyone else hear. I hesitated, my hand on the knob, because every one of us has had nights like that, nights when the weight of the job feels unbearable, when watching one more person slip away feels like too much. I thought maybe one of the newer nurses had ducked into the closet to pull herself together. I pushed the door open gently, ready to offer comfort, maybe even just stand with her in silence. But the closet was empty, just shelves stacked with gloves, IV tubing, linens, and the faint smell of antiseptic. The sobbing stopped the moment the door opened. I stood there, unsettled, my heart beating fast. I even checked behind the cart, as though someone could have hidden themselves in that tiny space. But there was no one. The only sound was the faint buzz of the fluorescent light above. I shook it off and stepped back into the hall, pulling the door shut behind me. That's when it happened. The sobbing started again behind me. Clearer this time, louder. A woman's voice, heavy with grief. Just a few feet away, my skin crawled. I spun around, but the hall was empty. The sound clung to me as I walked back to the station, soft at first, then fading like someone had stayed behind in that closet, crying where no one could see. The next morning, I asked one of the senior nurses about it, trying to sound casual. She gave me a long look, then said quietly, "You heard her, didn't you?" I asked. "Who?" She just shook her head. "It happens to the new staff first. That supply closet's hers. No one knows why, but people say she was a nurse here years ago. Lost a patient, maybe more than one, and never forgave herself. Some believe she never left. From then on, I couldn't pass that closet without my chest tightening. And I wasn't the only one. New aides would come in wide-eyed during report, whispering about the crying they'd heard. Some even swore they felt a hand brush their shoulder when they opened the door. The scariest night for me came a year later. I was restocking supplies alone. I crouched down to grab a box of gloves from the bottom shelf when I heard it again, soft sobbing, right above me this time. My throat tightened. I stood quickly, but of course, the closet was empty. I hurried out, clutching the box against my chest, but the sobbing followed me into the hall. It was right behind my ear, close enough that I could feel the breath of it. I didn't look back. I walked fast, my hands trembling so badly I nearly dropped the supplies. By the time I reached the station, the sound was gone. Now, I've made my peace with it in a way. Some of the older staff say she's not malicious, that she's mourning with us, carrying the grief we can't always show. But that doesn't make it easier when you hear her in the dark. To this day, if I walk by that closet on a night shift and hear muffled sobbing, I keep moving. Because I know what happens if you stop. The sound follows you, closer and closer, until you feel like she's standing right behind you, crying into your shoulder. And maybe she is. So tell me this. If you were walking down a silent hospice hallway at 2 a.m., and you heard someone sobbing in the supply closet, would you open the door, or would you keep walking and pretend you never heard it at all? Hi. I just want to take a moment to thank every single one of you for being here. Your support means more than words can ever express. Every view, every like, every comment, it all helps keep this channel alive and growing. If you've enjoyed these stories, please don't forget to like, share, and subscribe. It really makes a huge difference. I'd also love to hear from you. Share your own experiences in the comment section, and let me know where you're watching from. Hearing your stories and seeing the places you all come from is one of the best parts of this community. Thank you again for being part of this journey with me.